Masechet Yevamot, Daf Kaf Het. We left off with the Chidush of Rabbi Yochanan, who disagreed with our opening Mishnah. If you remember, our opening Mishnah was a case where there's 4 brothers, 2 of whom are married to 2 sisters. And they die, and according to the Mishnah, it doesn't matter in what order. The point is that we have 2 sisters, and Levi and Yehuda cannot take either one, because that would be Achot Zikukato, and so they must perform Chalitza with both. Rabbi Yochanan disagreed and said, well, if Reuven dies first, so then Rachel is available, and Levi or either brother can do Yibum with her, because there's only one sister here. And then afterwards, if they don't do Yibum yet, and then Shimon dies, so now Rachel becomes prohibited. But if in the meantime, Leah herself either dies, or one of the brothers does Chalitza with her, then Rachel becomes permitted once again. And so Rabbi Yochanan says, if one of the wives was permitted, becomes prohibited, but then becomes permitted again, then the one of the brothers can perform Yibum with her, the one that didn't do Chalitza with Leah, and so therefore disagrees with the Mishnah. Alright, so he rejected the Mishnah, but now we're going to begin with another question from the continuation of that very Mishnah. Tenan, he rejected the first half. He could say he rejects the second half, but how he's going to reject the whole perek? So Tenan, Hayta achat mehen asura al ha'echad isur arva, asur ba umutar ba achota, v'asheni asur bishtehen. So the next part of the Mishnah, if we remember, was a similar case, but here Levi is actually married to Rachel's daughter from a previous marriage. And therefore, this is actually, Rachel is his mother-in-law. Okay, so now, in this case, when Reuven and Shimon die, because Levi is prohibited to do Yibum with Rachel, does not apply at all, so this is not Achot Zikukato, because he has no Zikat to Rachel, so he is permitted to Leah, and he can do Yibum with Leah. And Yehuda, however, has to do Chalitza with both. And this is what we're going to ask about. Why does Yehuda have to do Chalitza with both? Let's assume right now that the one that is the mother-in-law is the one that became available first. Ve'amai leku chatan leyabem hach de'ena chamoto beresha ve'teve chamoto legabe idach ki bama shehutra ve'ne'esra ve'chazra ve'hutra tachzor letera harishon. In other words, if assuming that Reuven died first, and so at this point Rachel is prohibited to Levi, but is permitted to Yehuda. Yehuda could perform Yibum on Rachel. She's the only Yevamot here, so that's permitted. And then as next thing that happens, Shimon dies, and now Leah becomes available, and so now Rachel is prohibited to Yehuda. Okay, because they're now the sisters. But Levi can perform Yibum with Leah. When he does that, Rachel becomes permitted again to Yehuda. And so this fits into Rabbi Yochanan's leniency. Rachel was permitted, and then prohibited when Shimon dies, and then permitted again when Levi takes Leah. And so we have a challenge here to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan will disagree with this Mishnah. This Mishnah does not agree. Rabbi Yochanan does not agree with this Mishnah, because the Mishnah says Yehuda has to do Chalitza to both. But why? Why not perform Chalitza or Yibum with Rachel in this case? And so we answer, Amar Papa, no, we can reconcile Rabbi Yochanan with this Mishnah, assuming that the other sister, who is not the mother-in-law, is the one that became available first. Shimon died first, and that at that point, it's true. Leah is permitted to Yehuda, because he's the only one. And then Rachel comes along, and Reuven dies, and Rachel is now available, so they are both prohibited to Yehuda. Levi, however, can only take Leah, so he does Yibum with Leah, and since Rachel, at the time when she became available, when Reuven died, she was prohibited to Yehuda, so therefore Rabbi Yochanan also would agree that this is prohibited, and he would have to do Chalitza. And so Rav Papa is able to reconcile Rabbi Yochanan, at least with the continuation of the Mishnah. Now we move on to discussing the next section of the opening Mishnah of the Perek, where we said although in this case they're supposed to both perform halitza, what if they don't? What if they go ahead and do yibum? Both of them do yibum against the law. So, because they violated the law, we saw that Stam Mishnah says they both have to be removed from those marriages. However, then the Rabbi Eliezer adds that this is actually a machloket between the opinion before that they have to be removed is Bet Hillel, but Bet Shammai says they can remain married. So now we have a braita that expands on it. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer omer Bet Shammai omrim yekayemu, or Bet Hillel omrim yosiu. Bet Hillel says they violated the law, so you have to separate them. But Bet Shammai says, once they are in that relationship and perform yibum, then they're no longer each other's as achot zekukato. So although they violated, and now that they're there, you can leave them. Fine. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer about the machloket. However, we have two more opinions. Rabbi Shimon omer yekayemu. Rabbi Shimon says there's no machloket. It just everyone agrees that they can stay married. Abba Shaul omer kal haya lahem lebet Hillel b'dabar hazeh. Abba Shaul says that Bet Hillel was the one that was lenient in this case, as they are usually lenient, and said if they go ahead and marry against the law, they can nevertheless remain married. Shebet Shammai omrim yosiu, Bet Hillel omrim yekayemu. So he's the opposite of Rabbi Eliezer. According to him, Bet Shammai is the one that says if they do yibum, then you have to separate them, and Bet Hillel says if they do yibum, although they're not supposed to, they can remain married. And so now we just want to clarify the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Kiman, Ike Bet Shammai hainu Rabbi Eliezer, Ike Bet Hillel hainu Abba Shaul. Rabbi Shimon says that they can remain married. So is he's a generation after the houses. So who does he follow? If he's following Bet Shammai, then he agrees with Rabbi Eliezer. If he's following Bet Hillel, so then he agrees with Abba Shaul. We know he says that they can stay. So which version of the machloket does he agree with, one or the other? So we explain, no. Hachika amar lo nechliku Bet Shammai u Bet Hillel davar zeh. Rabbi Shimon thinks that there is no controversy between the houses regarding the subject. Everyone agrees that although they may not perform yibum, if they do, then they can remain married. We now continue to analyze the next case in the Mishnah, which is actually the case that we started today's daf with. Ta'ahat mehen. This is the case where one of the sisters is actually related to one of the brothers. In that case, right, just Rachel is his mother-in-law, and therefore Levi can take Leah as yibum. And we're going to ask, this is redundant because already back on daf chaf, we saw a case that is similar. This case has only 3 brothers, not 4, but it's the same principle. Levi is related to Rachel, and therefore, if both die, Levi can take Leah in Yibum, because there is no achot zekukato, there is no zika with Rachel, and so Levi is permitted to him. So we're going to ask now, why does the Mishnah include 2 cases that are based on the same principle? That seems redundant. So we ask, Hatanena hadazimna achota kesheyivimta o choleset o mijabemet. Right, that was the case there. When you have sisters who are also sisters-in-law, you can do chalitza or yibum, and that would only make sense in the case where the yavam is related to one of the sisters, and they could take the other. So we answer, Siricha, actually I need both. If we saw that one on Daf Chaf, Hatam Mishum Deleka Lemigzar Mishum Sheni Aval Hacha Teika Lemigzar Mishum Sheni Emala. I might have thought that this principle is true only in that case where there is no other brother to make a get, that you would have a reason to make a gezerah. But in our case, in our Mishnah, you might think that there should be a gezerah as follows. You might think that if we permit Levi to take Leah, then people will think it's permitted, and will even permit Yehuda to take Rachel. They won't realize that it's only permitted because Levi is related to Rachel, and they'll think it's just permitted to take Achot Zekukato, and so then they'll permit Yehuda also to Rachel. So we might think that in the case when there's two brothers, it's too confusing, and we should prohibit everyone in this case. And so therefore, we need this Mishnah to teach that even though there's another brother, it's still permitted for Levi to Leah, and people will know that that's the reason, and Yehuda will still be, will know that Yehuda is still prohibited to take Rachel. So that's why we need this case. And if I had only this case, Mishum dika sheni dekamocha chavalatam deleka sheni emala sericha. If I had only this case, now we actually switch the logic the opposite way. Because I have two brothers, so it's evident that the only reason it's permitted for Levi is because he is related, and that will be evident because of the contrast with Yehuda, who is prohibited, and so everyone will understand the principle. But if we have only one brother, then people will not know why Levi is permitted to Leah, and they will come to think mistakenly that Achot Zekukato is permitted in all cases. And won't realize that here it's only permitted because there is no zikah. So we might have thought that this case would be prohibited because there's no contrasting brother, and therefore we need this need to learn this case as well, and so that's why we need both. So that's it's a good reason that the Mishnah includes both Mishnayot, both cases. We now move on to the next clause in the opening Mishnah of the Perek about Isur Mitzvah, Isur Kedusha. And the point of the Mishnah there was that, let's say we have the same case, but instead of Levi and Ra'ah being direct Arva, in which case, since he's prohibited to Rachel, he can take Leah. What if the relationship between Levi and Rachel was only in Isur Mitzvah? For example, they would be related by a secondary Erva, just a Mishneh. So that would only be a D'Rabbanan. Or, let's say Levi was Kohen Gadol and prohibited as a lav to Rachel, or Rachel is a divorcee who was prohibited to be with Reuven, but did anyway, but still be prohibited to Levi. In all these cases, because the prohibition is not in Isur Arva, when it's in Isur Arva, there's no Zikah at all. So then he can take Leah. But if it's a Isur Lav or Isur D'Rabbanan, then there is still a zikah, and therefore, since there is a zikah with Rachel, Leah is Achot Zekukato, which is a D'Rabbanan problem, and so therefore he has to do chalitza anyway, and cannot perform yibum, not with Leah, not with Rachel. So that was the next clause in the Mishnah, and we ask, Hanami Tanena, back on Daf Chaf in the second Perek, we also said the same principle. Although without the case of sisters, we just said Isur Mitzvah, Isur Kedusha, Choleset, Velo Mityabemet. In the case of there's just two brothers and one dies, and it so happens that the Yevamah is prohibited to the Yavam in one of these ways. Mamzeret, whatever, or Kohen, and so in that case, it has to do chalitza and not yibum. From the fact that you have to do chalitza means there is a zikah, and so I could derive the same principle. Since there is a zikah in that case, then when there are two sisters, then there would be a zikah, and also he would have to do yibum with both. So we answer no. Hatam Isur Mitzvah lechuda, hacha Isur Mitzvah v'achota. Over there in the second Perek, there was only talking about the prohibition of a mitzvah secondary arayot, for example. But here we have two prohibitions, Isur Mitzvah, and they are also sisters. And being two actually helps. How so? Sakadatech amina lekum Isur Mitzvah bimkom Isur Arva v'tityabem kamashmalan. Because I might have thought that although the prohibition of a mitzvah would mean that they, in a single case, if it's just one sister, then it cannot perform yibum because there is an isur mitzvah. But when there's two sisters, it actually helps because it's prohibited enough for Levi to be Rachel in order to make that a very weak zikah, and therefore permit Levi to be with Leah. And so you might have thought that although Levi in a single sister case cannot take Rachel, because it's Isur Mitzvah, but in a double sister case, the prohibition is strong enough, then that actually helps us, if it's somewhat strong, to permit him to be with Leah and not worry about Achot Zekukato. So that's what we were thinking, Kamash Malan, and so that's why we need our Mishnah to teach us not so, that it's still prohibited. And so we just further another iteration of that, V'titjabem, and we say, really? What, you think they could do Yibum with the non-related sister, non-prohibited sister? Keman de medoraita dam yakameh, kapaga b'achot zekukato. Because if it's just Isur Mitzvah, right, then the prohibition of Mitzvah is only D'Rabbanan, if it's Sheni La'adayot, and therefore on a Deoraita level, he is Zikatu Rachel and Leah. So, what do you mean? How could he possibly perform Yibum in such a case? How could you say that? Oh, here's what we're thinking. Mishum Mitzvah, Abud Rabbanan, Kamash Malan. We might have thought that since, after all, the prohibition of Achot Zekukato itself is only Midrabanan. And so therefore, on a Deoraita level, he actually could do Yibum with Achot Zekukato. So in a regular case where they are not related, where he's not related to Rachel, so then no, he wouldn't be able to do that, right? There's Achot Zekukato. But if there's a prohibition, if there's even a D'Rabbanan prohibition of Levi with Rachel, because of Sheni La'arayot, then since the whole prohibition in the first place of Achot Zekukato is D'Rabbanan, so this D'Rabbanan may be sufficient to say that this that we don't have to worry about this Eshet Zekukato, and he would be able to take Leah. That's what we would have thought, and that's why we need this Mishnah to teach us that this same principle applies here. And no, in fact, Levi cannot. If he is related to Rachel only as mitzvah or only as Isur Kedusha, then he would not be able to take Leah in Yibum, and that's the Kamash Matlan. We now move on to the next clause in the Mishnah, which was Haita Achat Mehen. And the case here is where not just on one side, one of the brothers is related, but actually on both sides, because Levi is in Ervat to Rachel, he can take Leah and Yibum, and because Yehuda is in Ervat to Leah, he can take Rachel and Yibum. And now we wonder, why do we need this case? It's just the application of the same principle as in the previous case, but putting it on two sides. So why does the Mishnah say this case as well? Hatula mali hainuhach mali chad mali tre. Why do I need this case? It's the same if there's one brother who's related as two brothers who are related. And so we answer, Siricha, Tiyashmo inan hatam, mishum diika sheni de muchach, avalacha deleka sheni de kamuchach emala. If I had only the first case with one side, I would say in that case it's permitted because I have a contrast, knowing that I can permit this, and I don't have to worry that someone's going to say, oh, I guess there's no problem about Achot Zekukato ever, because the fact that Yehuda is prohibited will remind me that in general, Achot Zekukato is not allowed, and the Levi is only permitted because he is related to one of them. So I might have thought in this case there's no reason to make a gezerah, but in this case, where it would be confusing, all I see is everyone's permitted, and I might forget the whole law of Achot Zekukato, so I might say that we should prohibit in this case. So that's why the Mishnah comes and says, even in this case, it is in fact permitted. And on the flip side, if I had only the case of double, this case, each one is proof to the other. You see, Yehuda particularly has to take Rachel and not Leah, and Levi has to take Leah and not Rachel, because he can only take the one that you're not related to. Whereas if it was not so, it's not as clear in this case, because in this case Yehuda has to do a chalitza with both of the sisters, and so therefore the principle that it's not as clear that Levi has to take only Leah, and so I might have thought that this case should be prohibited because it's not as clear that the principle applies as in this case. So therefore we teach this one also. Sericha, I need both of them to teach me that. No, there's no reason to make a gezerah either way. Okay, the Mishnah then goes on and says, Zohi she'amru, and says this is the very principle this Mishnah is referring to the Mishnah in Perek Bet that says sisters who are sister-in-laws can do yibum or chalitza when one of them is related. Zohi leme'otemai. So this clause is saying this one is, and that is a limiting phrase. What is it coming to exclude? Leme'ote isur mitzvah lezeh ve'isur mitzvah lazeh. It's coming to exclude a case where similar to this, except that it was not a direct relation. What if it was only a secondary adva? So that Levi was prohibited to Rachel only midrabanan, and so then I might think that, perhaps when it's double-sided, even though it's only isur mitzvah, Levi could take Leah, and Yudah also, if it has isur mitzvah to Leah, could do yibum with Rachel, and so I need this clause to teach me that this also would be prohibited, same as if it's on one side. And we ask, why would we need to know that? What's the difference if there's an isur mitzvah on one side, one with one brother, or with both brothers on each sister? Arva, ulhai okimna isur b'mkom mitzvah b'mkom isur arva ulyabemu kamashma lan. So I might have thought that we only say that the isur mitzvah does not stand in place of an isur arva when it only applies on one side. In other words, like this again, let's say that they are related by an isur mitzvah. And so we do not say that the isur mitzvah overcomes the isur erva, and then Levi could take Leah. I might have thought that is only true when there's one side, because in that case I might get confused and I might think, well, if it's permitted on one side, then you know what? There's no problem of isur eshet, of isur zikat achot zikukato. So if it was only on one side, but perhaps if there's an isur mitzvah on both sides, then I wouldn't get confused because both are permitted, and so that's why I need this part of Mishnah to tell me that it doesn't matter whether it's on only one has isur mitzvah or both have isur mitzvah. In either case, they would have to perform chalitza and not yibum. We now continue with a sugya that we already learned most of it on Daf Tet Amud Bet. So we're not going to re-explain all the details. You can go back to the second half of Tet Amud Bet to go back to Tet Amud Bet to see it. But the ending here does add another point, which we will explain. Okay, so Amar Rabbi Yehuda Madav V'chen Tanei Rabbi Chiya Bechulan Ani Kore Bahen Hasura Lazeh Muteret Lazeh V'achota Kishehi Yevimta O Choleset O Mityabemet, according to Barav and Rabbi Chiya. In all of them, meaning in all of the 15 prohibited relations mentioned in Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph, I can find a case where I would apply a rule that one brother is prohibited to this one, but permitted to this, to that one, and vice versa. And they are also sisters who became sisters-in-law. So this is relevant to us because we've been discussing one such case where two brothers married to two sisters and they die. So that's rule number 2, right? These are sisters who are also sisters-in-law. And we have a case of this example would be mother-in-law, which one of the 15, where because Rachel is Levi's mother-in-law, that is prohibited, but permitted to this one. And the same thing here, Asura lazeh muteret lazeh. This one is Leah is Yehudah's mother-in-law, so prohibited to him, but permitted to the other sister. And so this is one classic case where both of the rules apply. And so Rabbi Chia says, instead of saying this being mother-in-law, you can figure out some scenario where all of the other 14 possibilities also, where if Levi was related to Rachel in that way, and Yehuda to Leah also in that same relation, you'd also have a scenario where they are sisters and one is prohibited but one is permitted. Okay, so that's a long exercise to go and actually create charts for all of them. The charts are available. Now, that was the first opinion. Second opinion, Rav Yehuda said only from the seventh case on, which is the mother-in-law, that's the mother-in-law case. From then on, yes, I can apply both of these rules and find cases where it applies. But the first six, you cannot find such a rule. Why? You cannot find such cases. My tama, kevan de bito beonasin hu de mashkachat la benisuin la mashkachat la. Because, for example, in the case of a daughter who's in Irva, should it be like this, right? In the case of a daughter, one can only construct such a scenario where Reuven would be prohibited to Rachel as a daughter, and Shimon prohibited to that as a daughter, but they can take each other. You can only construct such a scenario if they were not married to this woman, but act only in a rape case. And so therefore, according to Rav Yehuda, the Mishnah should not be including cases of ones, but rather only of nisuin, and therefore it's impossible to construct a scenario in the first six relations regarding nisuin. So therefore, he says their rule does not apply to the first six cases. Nisuin kamay, but nasin la kamay. Mishnah is only talking about proper marriage cases. Abaye, third opinion, Abaye says metagem af bito me'anusato kevan dashkochem mashkachada ibaya be'onasin teheve ibaya be'nisuin teheve. Abaye says no, I can include those even a daughter case, and I would have no problem that the Mishnah is talking about cases of rape, because if it's possible to find such a case where all the criteria of the Mishnah apply, where there's sarat tabat, and that causes not only prohibition against the erva, but also her co-wife and the co-wife's co-wife. If you can have such a case regarding regular marriage, good. And if you can find such a case regarding where that includes cases of rape, then also fine. So it's okay. He can find cases for all of them, except for aval eshet achiv shelo ya ba'olamo lo kevan de'adi bad Rabbi Shimon hu demashkachat la abil de'adi bad Rabbanan la mashkachat la biflukta la kamayre. So because the last case mentioned in the Mishnah of a non-contemporaneous brother, that is impossible to find such a case unless you follow Rabbi Shimon, who is more lenient, and he permits some cases of non-contemporaneous brothers. So if you allow him, then you can find such a case. But we don't want the Mishnah to be subject to machloket, and therefore Abaye says the first six cases are fine. It's the last case that he does not include. However, Rav Safra metargem af eshet achiv shelo ya ba'olamo mashkachat la b'shita ache ve'aliba de Rabbi Shimon. And Rav Safra does not mind that there is a case in the Mishnah that is subject to machloket. Okay, the Mishnah, according to Mishnah, can also include cases that have a machloket. And so how could you construct such a case? Well, you need six brothers. V'simanech met nolad v'ibem, met nolad v'ibem, and it occurs in that order. This is a complex chart, but let's go back to the chart that we saw back on Daf Tet, and it says follows. There are four brothers who are contemporaneous: Reuven, Levi, Yehuda, Shimon. And Reuven was married to Rachel, and Shimon was married to Leah. Rachel and Leah are sisters. And next, Reuven dies without children. Now, Leah, someone needs to do Yibum on Rachel. In the meantime, Yisachar is born. Okay, because Yisachar is now born while Rachel is alive, and so, but he cannot do Yibum because he was not alive when Reuven was. So they are non-contemporaneous brothers, and he's rejected from Yibum. Because he's rejected from Yibum, he is never going to be allowed to be with Rachel. So he's out of the picture. But that's no problem. Instead, another brother, Levi, comes in, he does Yibum. Next, Shimon dies, and leaving Leah. Someone has to do Yibum with Leah. In the meantime, Zevulun is born. Now, Zevulun was not alive at the same time as Shimon, and so he is rejected from performing Yibum. And so he's rejected, and therefore he's out of the picture. But Yehuda can perform a Yibum with Leah, and so they do. And next, Levi and Yehuda both die, leaving Rachel and Leah once again as Yevamot. In this case, each one is permitted. Yisachar cannot take Rachel because she was the Yevamah of a brother who non-contemporaneous brother, so that is simply sister-in-law, prohibited, and therefore permitted to Leah. And Zevulun similarly is prohibited to Leah, and so there's no problem of achot zikukato, and so he can take Rachel. And so there you go, right? We have a case of such, we can construct such a case. That's what we described here. Reuven, Shimon, Nisuin, Shnei Achiot, Aviv Yehuda, Nisuin Shete Nochriot. Met Reuven nolad Yisachar v'ibem Levi, met Shimon nolad Zevulun v'ibem Yehuda, metu Levi v'Yehuda belo banim benaflu lehu kamei Yisachar u'Zevulun, hasura leze moteret leze v'hasura leze moteret leze v'achota shehi yevimta. Notice that the Gemara here added yet another wrench. Says Levi and Yehuda were already married to two unrelated women. And so this, by adding that, it's adding the case of co-wives into this scenario. So Levi and Yehuda also had other wives previously. And so then they take Rachel and Leah as well. So that Levi's other wife would be the co-wife of Rachel. And just as Yisachar is prohibited to Rachel, he's prohibited to the co-wife. But Zevulun is permitted to her. And the same thing the other way around. And so when Levi and Yehuda die, Zevulun would be able to perform Yibum with Rachel's co-wife, because he's prohibited from Yehuda's wife, assuming that even if they are themselves sisters. So we can extend this also to co-wives, which is a criteria for it being in the first Mishnah. Okay, good. Now we have something new that we didn't learn yet on Daf Tet. Lama li yibem Yehuda, velo yibem Yehuda nami mashkachat la. Why do you have to conclude the scenario that Yehuda performed Yibum? So you have everything until that point, and Shimon dies, Zevulun is born, and nobody did Yibum to Leah yet. You would have the same thing. Zevulun, who is born afterwards, he can take Rachel, and Yisachar can take Leah. And so there's no need to add this. I mean, it's nice for parallelism because Levi died, but actually you can make the same scenario without him dying. And one less death in the family. And so we answer Mishum Sarah. Because we want to mention not only Yehuda, but also the co-wife, to teach that very point that just as Yisachar could take Leah, he could take the co-wife. So we need Yehuda to perform Yibum so that there could be a case of a co-wife that Yisachar can take. Good. So now we know how this case can apply with all the both rules that we had above and all the criteria of the Mishnah regarding a co-wife. But if you remember, the Mishnah also said that in all these cases, Sarah de Sarah ma'ika lememad. Not only is the co-wife prohibited, but the co-wife's co-wife is also prohibited. And so where would you see that in this case? The answer is just add two more brothers. Kegon tahadar v'yibeminhu nameh Gad ve'asher. after Levi and Yehuda die, then two other brothers who were contemporaneous then take Levi's original wife and Yehuda's original wife. They themselves, those other two brothers, Gad and Asher, have their own wives, and so in such a case, Zevulun would be prohibited to this Leah, because that was a non-contemporaneous brother's wife, and he would be prohibited to her co-wife's co-wife, but permitted to the Reuven's co-wife's co-wife, because he was permitted in the first place, and the same thing the other way around. And so if you just add two more brothers, you can even fit this case into the case of the Mishnah, which was not only Sarah, but Saratam. We now come to the next Mishnah, which is somewhat repetitive of cases we've seen before, although we see the opinion of Rabbi Shimon is going to be important here. So we have a simpler case of Shelosha Achin, Shanai Mehem Nisuin Shete Achayot, three brothers, two of whom are married to two sisters. If they should both die, here's, for example, forget that Yosef is around, so if they both die, you have Rachel and Leah both fall to Levi, and this is going to be the classic problem of Achot Zekukato. He has a Zikat to Rachel and to Leah, but they are sisters, so therefore he cannot take either in Yibum. He has to do Chalitza to both, according to Rabbanan. And now our Mishnah is going to say this applies not only if they are sisters, but also in a whole bunch of other types of relationships of a father and daughter, or a mother and daughter, or grandmother and granddaughter. So, or isha ubita, or isha ubat bita, or isha ubat bena, hare elu chosot velo mitya bemot. In all these cases, because he has a zikah to both of them, and they are prohibited to each other, so just like you have, they are all prohibited as ervat zekukato. However, Rabbi Shimon Poter, Rabbi Shimon says you do not have to do chalitza. You cannot do yibum. No yibum, no chalitza. They simply can go free without anything. The Gemara will explain why. He says it's a biblical prohibition, so this is actually like an isur erva. Haita achat mehen asura alav isur erva, asur ba mutar ba'achota. If in such a case, Levi was actually related to Rachel, if that was his mother-in-law or daughter-in-law, then, because there's no zikah here, he actually is permitted to take le'ah in yibum, and that would be the same. The same would be true if whatever their Rachel and Leah's relationship would be. Isur misvah or isur kedusha chosot v'lo mityabemot. However, if the prohibition between Levi and Rachel is only midrabanan, or only alav, only isur kedusha misvah, then that is not sufficient. There is still somewhat of a zikah there, and because there is a zikah, he still cannot take either one. Okay, good. All principles we saw. The Gemara will ask why we need these repetitions. So first we explain to Rabbi Shimon. Tanya Rabbi Shimon poter b'shtehem min hachalisa min haibum shene'emar v'isha el achota lo tikach lisror. Rabbi Shimon says that both sisters who are related and both have a zikah do not even have to do chalitza or yibum. The women just go free, because the pasuk says a woman and her sister you cannot take if they're going to be co-wives. In a case where should you take both, they would be co-wives. So then, if you can't take both, then you cannot take either. And so that is in this case, right? At the time that you would take them, they are co-wives. In other words, if you treat the zikah like a marriage, then he'd be married to two women and therefore prohibited as sisters who are co-wives. Therefore, you cannot do even one, and so there is no obligation at all, like the case of just, saratabat, that they just go free. Good. Haita achat mehen. Now, if one of them was forbidden, then he can take the other. Hatula mali, hainu hach. We already saw this in the previous Mishnah. So we answer, we need it to teach that it's true even for Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon is terich. Salka datech amina ha'il v'amar Rabbi Shimon shete achayot lo chosot velo mitjabemot. So since Rabbi Shimon said if there's two sisters fall to him, they cannot do chalisa or yibum when they're not related to the yavam. Ligzor mishum shete achayot alma kamash malan. I might think that I should make a gezerah that even if he's related to one of them, I should not allow, in the case he is related to one of them, perhaps we should not allow Yibum to the other, because if I allow Yibum in this case, then it might get confusing, and I may allow Yibum even in the case when they're not related. So therefore it teaches that, no, don't worry about that. Even Rabbi Shimon, who says no Yibum and no Chalisa when they are not related, still would permit Yibum in a case where he is related to one of them. He could perform Yibum on the other. Let's finish off the discussion of this Mishnah. Isur Mitzvah, the last clause says that if one of the sisters is prohibited as a secondary relation, or Isur Kedusha, then you have to do Chalitza with both of the sisters. So we asked, after all, we've been explaining this part of the Mishnah according to the Bishimon. Rabbi Shimon said, in the case when they are sisters, so because they are prohibited as sisters, so no chalitza and no yibum. And in this case, even though their Levi, if Levi was prohibited as Isur Adva Terachel, then there's no Zikah, he could take Le'ah. But in the case when Levi is prohibited Terachel only Midrabanan, only as a lav, still, Medeoraita, there is a Zikah. And since there is a Zikah, according to the Bishimon, anytime that there is a Zikah to both, they don't need Yibum or Chalitza. So how come, in the case of Mitzvah, the Mishnah is saying you need Chalitza to both? According to the Bishimon, they can go off without anything. And the answer is, you're right, really, they could go off without anything. But it's confusing, so the rabbis make a gezerah, mishum isur misvah da'alma. In a general case where you just have two brothers, and one dies, and the Yevamot is related as Sheniah, or Isur Kedusha, to the Yavam, and so if we allow them to go free in the case where they're sisters, then we may allow them to go free in the case even when they're not sisters, and just one, because we'll remember that case, and forget that the reason they were allowed to go free was only because, according to the Bishimon, they are sisters. And then we may allow it even when they're not sisters. Okay, so that makes sense why I would need, if these were Isur Mitzvah, why she, Rachel, would need Chalisa, to remember that is prohibited. But how about the sister? Why does she need Chalisa also? Right? She is not related to Levi, so I won't come to think that she's not a Yisur Mitzvah, so I won't come to think anything like that. So we answer Gezerah Chotam Mishum La Tadida. We make another Gezerah because of the fate of the sister. In other words, if we permit Leah to go free, then we may say, since she's permitted, then Rachel also can go free without Chalisa, and so and then we would end up permitting a Isur Erva to go free without Chalisa. Okay, V'hagabe Erva la Gazrina. And hold on, if you're going to make such a Gezerah, then why don't you make Gezerah when this is Isur Erva? Levi and Rachel or Isur Erva, then we say, even the Bishimon agrees that he cannot take Rachel and he can take Leah. So why don't you say such a Gezerah? Or if you permit Yibum with Leah, then people are going to get confused between the sisters, and they permit to take Rachel also as an Isur Erva. So we say, no, you don't have to worry about that. Right? Everybody knows in such a case that, of course, these are totally prohibited and there's no Zikah, and everybody knows Levi is taking Leah only because the sister was Yisur Erva. And so this has a call, this is announced, everyone explains it to each other, and there's no way someone's going to mix up such a extreme example of this being an Isur Karet and this being permitted. The contrast is enough to be self-explanatory. But if one is only an Isur Mitzvah, then it's not as apparent, and therefore both require Chalisa, according to Rabbi Shimon. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.